Toronto has been inhabited for centuries by indigenous people who named the land Tikarantu, which meant the place where trees stand in water. In 1793, someone would not be able to predict that Toronto would grow from a small military fort to the largest city in Canada in less than 200 years. In this episode of Toronto Origins, we'll be looking at the history of how Toronto started out as a small military fort. John Graves Simcoe anticipated a confrontation with the United States and planned to build a naval station at Toronto to control Lake Ontario. This was due to Britain's support of the Aboriginal people of the Ohio Country, who were savagely battling the Americans for possession of their territories. During that crucial period, Simcoe, in his function as Lieutenant Governor of the British province of Upper Canada, transferred the provincial capital from the perilous border town of Niagara to Toronto. In 1793, Simcoe ordered Toronto to be built. The civilian population grew once the government renamed Toronto York. Fort York had a significant influence on the small rural community's early social and economic development. Simcoe did not, however, erect York's strong defenses as he had planned. His commanders decided that the Lake Ontario Squadron should be located in Kingston, 250 kilometers to the east, in 1794 after fighting between the British and Americans had ceased. The old log buildings in Fort York quickly deteriorated. Simcoe's successors built brand new barracks in the late 1790s, 100 meters to the east of the present position, for the modest garrison assigned to the provincial capital. On the site of the present fort, Government House, the Lieutenant Mansion, and the Governor's residence were built around 1800. In 1807, relations between the British and Americans once more deteriorated. In order to prepare for battle, Major General Sir Isaac Brock reinforced Fort York in 1811. The West Wall and Circular Battery were already in place at that time. In 1812, the United States invaded Canada after declaring war on it. On April 27, 1813, the American Army and Navy stormed York with 2,700 soldiers on board 14 ships and schooners, as well as 85 cannons. The 750 British, Canadian, Mississaugas, and Ojibwe defenders possessed 12 cannons. The Americans seized control of the territory west of the fort while being defended by their naval guns. The overwhelming odds prompted the defenders to evacuate from the landing point to Fort York despite their heroic attempts. The British commander, Major General Sir Roger Sheaffe, then withdrew eastward, blowing up the fort's gunpowder depot, which was near the modern memorial area. The devastating explosion resulted in 250 American casualties, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike, who served as the Americans' field commander. 157 British and 320 Americans died altogether in the 6-hour battle. When Sheaffe's trained men returned to Kingston, the Mississaugas and Ojibways retreated into the woods and the militia of the town was compelled to resign. American forces ruled York for 6 days. They plundered residences, stole or destroyed goods, and set fire to Government House and the Parliament buildings at what are now Front and Parliament Streets. The White House, the Capitol, and other significant buildings were set on fire by the British in retaliation after capturing control of Washington in 1814. The Americans returned to a hapless York in July 1813 to destroy their barracks and other buildings they had ignored in April. The British quickly built Fort York on what is now Simcoe's original site. In August 1814, the American squadron tried to enter Toronto Bay once more, but Fort York was strong enough to repel them. The end of the War of 1812 was announced to York in February 1815. The good news was that Canada had successfully repelled the American invasion and that peace had been restored. The British retained Fort York under surveillance after the battle, despite the fact that the majority of the soldiers relocated to new barracks 1 kilometer to the west of the fort in 1841. During times of peace, Fort York's defenses were allowed to deteriorate, only to be improved during emergencies like the rebellion crisis of 1837 to 1841, or when conflict with the United States was anticipated, such as in 1861 to 1862. In 1870, the majority of Canada's fortifications, including Fort York, were transferred to the country's control. Up until the 1880s, when the fort's cannons and earthworks were no longer functional, the harbor defenses were maintained. but up until the 1930s, the Army kept using the site for training, barracks, offices, and storage. Fort York hosted a few military activities even during World War II. Between 1932 and 1934, the City of Toronto refurbished Fort York in honor of the 100th anniversary of the city's establishment in 1834. On Victoria Day in 1934, Fort York opened as a historical site and museum. The largest collection of authentic War of 1812 buildings can be found here at Fort York. Fort York contains two military cemeteries and a piece of Toronto's 18th century landscape, along with part of the 1813 battlefield. Here at Fort York, we have a substantial amount of archaeological resources that can allow historians to better comprehend how Toronto grew from a small military fort to the large city that it is today.